Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the L. Ron Hubbard Theater in Hollywood, California. Tonight we present a live broadcast of the Golden Age Radio Hour featuring L. Ron Hubbard's ghost story, The Death Flyer. Lost deep in the ebb and tangle and echoing against the starless, sullen sky, the owl's dismal chatter came like the rattle in a dying man's throat. Jim Bellamy paused on the ties, the beat of his heart surging through his throat. The hoot of an owl meant that someone would die. He forced a smile to his lips and shrugged, setting off again through the ancient and decayed tracks. He had been a fool to start back this late. He had not particularly enjoyed this job of surveying, but in these days a civil engineer had to take what he could get, even though it meant the tangles and swamps and insects of northern Maine. He had overstayed himself, checking over his measurements. He had sent his crew back to their isolated lumber camp. If anything happened to him and he could not return, they would merely assume that he had chosen to spend the night in the open. And an inner self, or outer self, kept telling him that something would happen, that this night was not like other nights. A vibration of unrest was in the air. He stumbled along the tracks he could not see and blessed them and cursed them in one breath. This railroad had been deserted for about 10 years. A train had gone through a bridge and into a swollen stream, and the road had never been able to rebuild for lack of funds and interest on the part of shippers who remembered the incident. It was a shame for all this work to go to waste this way. Rails and ties were still in their place, all there. The owl gave his death rattle again. Jim Bellamy quickened his pace. Suddenly he tripped. His stomach felt light. He heard a growing roar reverberate through the trees. When he tried to get up, he was blinded by a yellow eye, and larger than with the noise. He rolled to one side, but he could not get off the tracks. Something was holding his shirt, pinning him down, and the yellow eye stabbed straight through him and held him horror-stricken to the ties. Oh, good God. It was a train, and he was in its path. He shut his eyes tightly. The roar shook the earth, and through it seemed to hear the call of the owl which had foretold his death. A shrill screech bit through the roar, and then the thunder died to a hiss, and Jim Bellamy sat up. Somehow he was no longer on the track, but beside it, a mountain of rust-eaten steel reared up before him. Flame licked out and illuminated a cab. A shadowy face peered down.
You right, stranger?
Sure, I'm all right.
Well then, why the hell don't you get on board? You think I got all night?
Sure,
said Bellamy, stumbling up.
Not here, you fool. What do you think we got coaches for? Get back there and get aboard. I'm in a hurry tonight. Hey, do you realize it's 9:15?
Dazedly, Bellamy went back along the line of weather-beaten wooden coaches. Through the dirty windows, he could see faces peering curiously at him. The lights which burned in the train, thought Bellamy, with a start, threw no reflection on the ground. He swung himself up into a vestibule which smelled of cinders and soft coal gas and stale cigars, and opened the door into a coach. The old-fashioned lamps threw a dismal greenish light along the scarred red plush seats. Half a dozen silent passengers stared moodily ahead, paying him no heed. Bellamy slid into a seat near the door. The engine panted. The couplings clanked as the engineer took up the slack, and then the train went rolling off along the uneven bed. Bellamy found that he could not think clearly or connectedly. The fall must have given him a nasty crack on the head. Maybe it was worse than he had thought. He sat motionless for some time. Of his fellow travelers, he could see little more than the backs of their heads. There was something unnatural about the way they sat. Tense, was the word. Tense and expectant. A man with a dull, corroded brass button slouched into the car. His cap was pulled far down over his face, and in his hands he held a battered ticket puncher. He came back to where Bellamy sat.
Ticket, please.
Bellamy sat up straight, staring at the face over him. The flesh hung in loose clouds from under the eyes. The teeth were broken behind black lips. A scar on the forehead bled down over the gray flesh, but no blood touched the floor. The eyes were unseen, merely black holes in ashen putty. Bellamy recovered his voice.
I don't have a ticket.
You're a new one. I never saw you before. We're late now, and I can't stop to put you off.
Bellamy fumbled with the breast pocket of his checkered flannel shirt.
I can give you money.
Money? I have no need of money. Not now. All I want is your ticket. Haven't you got a ticket?
Bellamy detected emotion farther up in the car. He saw that the two passengers were getting slowly to their feet and coming back. They ranged themselves behind the conductor, staring at Bellamy. The air was charged with an evil, decayed smell. Bellamy came halfway to his feet, gripping the edges of the seat, his face blanching. Not one of those two had visible eyes. Their flesh was the color of dirty lard. Their lips were black and their faces were slashed with many cuts.
He's not one of us. He doesn't belong here.
Bellamy moved closer to the window. The three, hands loose at their sides, moved slowly ahead, swaying and jolting under the influence of the train. It was several seconds before Bellamy understood what they were trying to do. Then he realized that their unseen eyes held the threat of death. He stood up, crouching forward, and though his face was white, his jaw was stubbornly set. Bellamy felt like a trapped animal about to be mangled by a hunter. Big as he was no match for three. Fleshless hands reached out and gripped him. Bodies pressed him back. He struck as hard as he could, twisting and writhing to get away. Suddenly, above the clatter of steel wheels on rails, a clear and controlled voice said,
"Let him be. He does not know."
The three fell away, backing into the aisle, looking neither to the right nor the left. They were like marionettes on strings, jiggling loosely as the train swayed. Bellamy braced himself and rubbed at his throat where red marks were beginning to appear. Looking through the three, he was startled to see a young girl in a flame-colored dress poised in the aisle. Her cheeks were white as flour, but there was a certain beauty about her which Bellamy could not at once define. She was small, not over 5'4" in height. The dress clung to her smooth body and rippled as she moved. Her eyes were dark and sad.
Go back to your seats.
The six moved woodenly to their places and seated themselves without a backward glance. But the conductor stood his ground.
He has no ticket.
I have it. I have had it for a long, long while.
She reached into a small purse she carried and drew out a crumpled green slip which she handed to the man with the corroded brass buttons. He scanned it and then punched it with a quick snap. She watched him open the door and disappear. And then she came slowly toward Bellamy. And reaching slowly out, she took his hands in hers and sank down across from him, searching his face.
You do not remember.
Bellamy shook his head. He was too astonished to answer her immediately. Now that she was near him, he could smell the delicate odor of lilies of the valley. Her fine face was up-tilted to him, and her hands were shaking.
I have waited long for 10 years, and now you have come. I knew that it would be you. The waiting was long, but now that you are here, I see that time was nothing. Please, don't you remember?
He could make no answer to her even flow of words. He felt somehow that he should know, that he should remember, but his mind was dull.
Remember how you wired me, How you said, whenever you come, I shall be here on this platform waiting for you. And now I see that you have tired of waiting, and that you have come to me. You see, I could not come to you. I must stay here with these. It is hard sometimes, harder than you know. But now all that is past and you are with me again.
She raised her slim hand to his face and touched his cheeks.
You are not changed. Though I cannot see you very well, just enough. Oh, just to feel you is enough. Please never go away again. I have never been so lonely. I have waited so long.
Bellamy felt as though someone had thrust a dagger into his heart and twisted it there. Oh, this girl was almost blind. He was afraid to answer her, afraid that his voice would dispel the illusion she cherished. But speak he must, and through the lump that was large in his throat, he said,
No, I won't leave you again.
Then somehow he had gathered her close to him, and she was vibrant against him. Her breath was warm and sweet upon his face. He held her there for a long time.
Then it is you after all. I waited so long.
The conductor came back, staring at his nickel-plated watch.
He'll make it. He'll make it. But there's only half an hour left.
The girl shivered against Bellamy.
Must it happen again now that...
Must what happen?
Bellamy demanded with a sudden clarity of mind. He felt like a hypnotized person returning to life.
What? Why, the wreck, of course. Oh, but then you would not know about that. You were waiting. You were not with me then.
The conductor snapped shut the watch and moved heavily up the car, muttering.
He'll make it. He'll make it.
The wreck.
Yes. This is August the 16th, isn't it? Well, certainly it must be, otherwise we would not be out. August the 16th is the date. Don't you see? 10 years ago tonight. I hate it, but there is nothing I can do. Wait. Dearest, wait. Perhaps you can stop it. If anyone does, then it will be over.
Bellamy felt his mind grow leaden again. But he stood up, pressing his back into the seat. His eyes were staring and his jaw was set. He knew that somehow this was all wrong, that this couldn't be happening, but it was.
In 10 minutes, they'll be aboard. They'll hang out a red lantern and we'll stop. If you could make them...
Bellamy started down, and he stared at her. His heart was pounding against his ribs, and he labored with a problem he could not understand. A red lantern? And somehow everything would be all right if he could stop this thing? He leaned quickly over her and kissed her soft, moist lips. Then he went up the car past the 6 passengers. They were all still leaning forward, staring with their sunken sockets and seeing nothing. Bellamy swung open the door, walked across the swinging vestibule, pushed open another door, and found himself in the baggage car. The baggage man stared at him and nodded. The baggage man's face was a black shadow, and his hands were white and thin.
What's the use, mister? You can stop them.
Bellamy swung on by and went on through a door. He crawled up over the tender and looked down on the cab. The engineer turned to stare at Bellamy, and Bellamy stared back. The engineer's face was nothing but a shadow on which was perched the billed cap of his kind. The engineer's hand was on the throttle, easing it back.
You can't do anything. Look out, I gotta stop.
Why don't you just this once, then?
It's no use, mister. I've tried it, and I can't. That's a red lantern, and the flag stopped. I got my orders.
Bellamy saw the man haul on the brake. Steam hissed. Steel wheels groaned as they slid on the rails. Bellamy saw that they were drawing up to a platform, overgrown with long weeds. The station house had gradually collapsed into itself until only a few boards were left. a few boards, and the drooping roof beam like a gallows against the sullen sky. The ancient sign creaked and banged in the wind. Once again, Bellamy heard the call of the owl and shivered. Suddenly, beside the cab, there appeared a shock of thick black hair. The man reached for the rungs and swung up to the cab, followed by two other men more ragged and dirty than he. The first one was tall and thick through the body like a carelessly filled bag of rags. His teeth were yellow. His eyes blazed.
Pull out. I'm riding here.
You can't ride here.
Who's to say I can't?
I say you can. Not unless you got the orders tonight.
What do I care for orders?
The thick one pulled a heavy sawed-off shotgun from his coat and pointed it at the engineer. The engineer jammed the throttle ahead. The train lurched and started. The thick one was laughing, and Bellamy smelled whiskey cheap and strong upon the fellow's breath. It had happened so fast that he could do nothing. The engineer was reaching for his hip pocket where a wrench bulged. One of the others yelled a warning. And the thick one sent a roaring blast of flame and led straight into the engineer's face. The man sank across his throttles, throwing them wider. Bellamy was sick with the cold brutality of it. But the scattergun was empty, and he saw no other weapons, so he jerked up the fireman's shovel and aimed a blow at the other one's skull. The other two, their faces gray blobs in the red flame, leaped ahead to snatch at the handle. Bellamy avoided them. Bellamy yelled with rage and twisted the shovel free. He saw a blackjack come up with a swift, lethal swing. He dodged. The two men he faced laughed and weaved drunkenly. The blackjack landed at the base of Bellamy's neck. Bellamy stumbled. A fist jarred into his chest. He doubled up, almost out, still trying to fight them back. The big one brought down the muzzle of the scattergun and kicked Bellamy back onto the fireman's seat. Then the three crawled up onto the tender and stood for a moment against the sky, shouting at each other to be heard above the roar of the speeding train. Bellamy, sick and dizzy, crawled out from the corner. He could not think of anything but the girl, and these three drunken men were going back toward her. He had heard a snatch of their shouts. Oh, that had been enough. His head was ringing, and he could not concentrate. He had the feeling that he was doing wrong to leave the cab, but he could not reason why. The engineer was hanging against the throttles, but Bellamy did not understand. Bellamy hitched himself down toward the baggage car. He shoved open the door with shaking hands. The baggage master was sprawled among the shifting trunks. His hands were outstretched, and he did not move. The cash box was standing open, keys jingling in the padlock. Bellamy went on back. His brain was spinning like a maelstrom. When he passed through the second vestibule, and then his mind went clear again, he peered through the filthy pane of glass. How long had he been at this? How much time had passed? Somehow that was important above all else. The passengers were pressed back against the wall. With his scattergun in hand, the thick one held them at bay while his two companions went through pockets and grips. Their shouts were loud and harsh, and their faces laughed, but their eyes did not. And then Bellamy saw the girl. She was pressed far back against the rearmost seat, her body tense, her hands thrown back in fear. The thick one reached out with a hard hand and jerked her toward him with a bellowed laugh. He twisted her wrist until she knelt in the aisle, and then holding the scattergun loosely in one hand, he shifted his grip and snatched at her shoulder. Her lips went white with pain. The thick one laughed again.
Hold her!
He shouted to his aides. Bellamy was through the door, axe clutched in his two strong hands. Suddenly the girl whipped free. The thick one's knuckles crashed against her eyes. She screamed and sank back on her knees, sinking down into the aisle. A mad thought went through Bellamy's brain. So that's why she was blind. He raced the length of the car. One of the aides shouted a warning. The thick one whirled. His yellow teeth flashed. The scattergun was coming up. Bellamy lashed down with the axe, and the blade bit cleanly through the matted hair, through the skull, deep into the face. But the big one stood, and the wound did not bleed. The aides screamed and ran, flashing out through the door. But the passenger stood, with hands still upraised, without expression or movement. The thick one tottered backward, clawing at the axe that was buried in his head, knees buckling. He stumbled out through the door and out of sight. Bellamy kneeled beside the girl. lifting her gently and holding her against him.
It's all right. It's all right. You have come at last. I gave them your ticket here. Perhaps after this we'll be... But the train! Good God, stop the train!
Bellamy stared blankly at her without understanding. She clutched at his shirt, raising herself up.
Please, God, please don't let him go again. Please let him stop this, please!
She buried her face in his shirt and moaned. Suddenly, a brain not Bellamy's took command of him. He started up and faced to the front. He saw the picture of the engineer slouched against the throttles. Running, he went up the aisle, through the door, and down to the second coach. He could feel the wheels lifting from the curves under the onslaught of too much speed. The train swayed drunkenly from side to side, threatening to leave the tracks at any moment. He was aware of someone behind him, and he turned back. The girl in red was coming, groping blindly up the aisle, trying to keep up with him. The dead conductor moved restlessly as the train swayed. In the baggage car, the baggage master was pinned down under the upset trunk. His arms were still outstretched. Bellamy pushed the girl up to the tender and followed her. The rocketing perch was hard to hold. Bellamy slid down into the cab. He heard the girl scream. Pulling the engineer away from the throttles, he clutched them and hauled them back. He tried to find the brake and could not. Some lever here was the brake. Something in this boiler or on this cab would stop the train. The girl cried out again, her hands on his shoulders, trying to drag him to his feet. He gripped her arms and looked down into her drawn face. It was too late for brakes. Too late for anything. The front wheels left the rails. The roar of water was under them, far, far under them. The train went off slowly, disjointed and lashing. Space was greedy, sucking the cars down. Holding the girl close to him, Bellamy braced himself against the crash. He could feel her quiver against him. He could hear the moan of agony which came up from her tight throat. The thunder and crushed steel, the roar of escaping steam. The splinter of wood was suddenly swallowed by the cry of swirling water.
Don't go away from me.
The voice receded, growing fainter and fainter until it was gone. In its place was the whisper of water against the sand. Rough hands brought Bellamy to his feet. Daylight blinded him. He was aware of an ache which sent quick lightning flashes through his head when he moved. Through the swirl of faces about him, he could see a crumpled ruin against the bank from which protruded a rust-eaten set of wheels. Farther along, he could see the hulk of an old locomotive bent and twisted and brown under the clear sky. His eyes focused on the faces, and a single thought shot a question from him.
Where is she?
He's balmy,
Remarked a rod man. Bellamy suddenly recognized as his own.
Oh, you'd be balmy too, I guess.
Reported a recorder in great heat. Bellamy's camp cook was feeling Bellamy's head.
It's all right. He ain't hurt, none to speak about.
But the wreck.
What wreck? You mean this old train here? That fell off the trestle about 10 years ago. Yeah, I reckon. That's what made him shut this line down. About 10 years ago it was, I think. I think about this time of year, too. But, you ain't been in no wreck. You stumbled off that trestle in the dark and lit in the soft sand. Whew, some drop, ain't it? Yeah, we've been looking for you all morning, but, you ain't hurt none but.
You went a hell of a ways past the lumber camp.
Said the cook.
What's the matter? Soused? Don't tell me you got lost.
I guess I did.
Come on, we'll tow you back to camp. Hell, unless we get you right quick, we'll lose 2 days or more.
Yeah. We won't lose anything. I guess we better get back on the job.
Okay with us.
Said the recorder and helped Bellamy walk up the steep bank.
But I think you better lay up for a while. Yeah. You must have been out for a long time, and that ain't so good.
Bellamy stopped at the top and looked back at the old wreck, half buried in the sand and water. It was rusty and broken and forgotten, somehow forlorn. A voice seemed to whisper in his ear.
I will be waiting on the other side. The next time we'll get through.
He looked about him, startled, but his survey crew was silent, waiting for him to go on. He stepped off down the uneven trail and vanished in the twilight of the woods.